There comes a moment when the noise of others begins to sound like a permanent storm inside your own chest. You try to reason with it. You try to soften it. You try to bend yourself into something more acceptable, more tolerable, more worthy of staying. But peace does not grow in places where your spirit is constantly translated into something smaller than it is. It dies there quietly, without announcement, while you are still busy pretending that endurance is the same as strength, and then something inside you shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the calm certainty of a door closing that will not reopen the same way again. You realize that not every battle deserves your voice. Not every wound deserves your explanation, and not every presence deserves your staying. There is a kind of wisdom that arrives when you stop negotiating with what keeps breaking you. Walking away becomes less of an action and more of a return to yourself, to your breath, to the parts of you that were buried under constant justification. You do not announce it. You do not perform it. You simply let go. And in that letting go, something long denied finally begins to breathe again. Peace is not found in confrontation, but in the quiet decision to withdraw from what breaks you. This idea begins in the understanding that many people confuse resolution with victory, as if speaking louder could repair what silence has already exposed. But confrontation often becomes another room where pain is rehearsed rather than healed, where every word adds weight instead of release. In that space, you begin to notice how easily the self is stretched into shapes meant to survive misunderstanding rather than live in truth. Peace does not demand that you remain in places where your spirit must constantly negotiate its own worth. Instead, it arrives as a quiet intelligence that recognizes when continuing becomes a form of self-abandonment disguised as loyalty. There is a turning point where staying and explaining and defending no longer feel like acts of courage, but like repetitions of exhaustion, and in that realization withdrawal becomes not escape, but recognition of what cannot be repaired through presence. It is the moment when silence stops being absence and starts becoming protection, a boundary drawn not out of anger, but out of the deep understanding that some environments cannot hold the fullness of who you are. So peace is not the reward of winning arguments, but the result of choosing yourself without announcement, choosing to step out of cycles that require you to diminish your own understanding in order to be accepted. Because every time you stay where your truth is constantly questioned, you begin to lose fragments of clarity that are difficult to retrieve, in peace becomes less about resolution and more about preservation of what remains intact within you. The quiet decision to withdraw is often misunderstood as distance, but it is actually alignment with a deeper internal truth, one that no longer seeks permission to exist fully. In that space of leaving without noise, there is a kind of clarity that cannot be negotiated or reversed. It settles into the body like a steady knowing that you no longer need to participate in what distorts your peace. And although the world often praises endurance over departure, there is a deeper endurance in choosing not to call strength in staying, because what is called given is sometimes only fear of what freedom might require, and peace quietly insists that you listen to the part of yourself that knows when enough has already been given, So withdrawal becomes a language without noise, where the self is no longer translated through conflict, but through clarity, a clarity that does not ask for permission or approval, but simply continues in its own direction. And in that movement there is a steady unlearning of the belief that peace becomes to be argued into existence or proven through into oneself, without the need to explain, more intentional aware fracture or remain, without the need to expand into silence, continues beyond what the spirit can sustain, without breaking further into silence itself. Walking away is not weakness. It is a form of sacred self-respect that emerges only after a person has seen clearly what staying begins to cost them. It is not an impulsive retreat or a dramatic exit shaped by emotion alone, but a quiet recognition that dignity cannot continue to coexist with environments that constantly require its erosion. People often misinterpret departure as surrender because they measure strength by endurance alone, by how much a person can tolerate before breaking. But there is another kind of strength, less visible and far more difficult, which is the strength to stop participating in what diminishes you. It is the moment when you no longer confuse being needed with being valued, when your presence is no longer measured by how much discomfort you can absorb for the sake of keeping things intact. Sacred self-respect begins where justification ends, where you stop explaining your pain to those who have already decided not to understand it, and instead begin to listen to the part of yourself that has been quietly asking for release all along. Walking away in this sense is not an escape from reality, but a deeper engagement with it, because it requires you to see things exactly as they are, without the softness of denial or the habit of emotional bargaining. There is a kind of clarity that arrives when you finally admit that not every connection is meant to be preserved, not every bond is meant to be repaired, and not every history deserves a continuation at the expense of your own stability. In that recognition, self-respect becomes sacred because it is no longer performative. It is no longer about proving worth to others, but about honoring the quiet truth that your existence should not require constant sacrifice to remain acceptable. And so leaving becomes an act of alignment rather than rejection, a way of returning to a version of yourself that was slowly being abandoned in small, unnoticeable ways while trying to hold things together. The world may label it as distance, as coldness, as giving up, but those labels belong to perspectives that still measure value through endurance rather than preservation. In reality, walking away is often the first time a person chooses to stop negotiating their worth in spaces that have already decided its limits. It is a decision made not in anger, but in clarity, where silence becomes a boundary and distance becomes a form of care directed inward, where the act of stepping back is not about punishing others, but about refusing to participate in cycles that require self-erasure as a condition of belonging. And in that quiet unfolding, there is a deep recalibration of identity that begins to form around what it means to no longer ask for permission to exist fully, to no longer shrink in order to remain, to no longer trade peace for presence in places where presence itself becomes a slow diminishing of everything you are becoming, without needing to explain or justify or remain attached to what has already begun to unravel beyond knows, before them the point of repept, and the spirit already leaves long before the feet decide to move. And that movement is not departure in the ordinary sense, but a return to a kind of internal order that had been disrupted by the constant demand to stay where staying required, forgetting oneself again, until the idea of self became something negotiable rather than something inherent, and in that realization walking away reveals itself not as loss, but as recognition of what could no longer be sustained without erosion continuing quietly underneath every attempt to remain connected to what was already slipping away into forms that no longer held truth or balance or care in the way they once seemed to promise. Silence is not emptiness. It is power that refuses to argue with chaos. This understanding begins when a person realizes that not every sound deserves a response, and not every provocation deserves participation. In a world that often rewards reaction over reflection, silence becomes a radical choice, a refusal to be pulled into the disorder that feeds on constant engagement. It is not the absence of thought or feeling, but the presence of restraint, the disciplined decision to hold back what could easily be released in anger, explanation, or defense. Chaos thrives on attention. It grows stronger each time it is fed with reaction, each time it is met with urgency instead of distance. But silence interrupts that cycle. It does not enter the argument. It does not join the distortion. It simply stands apart with a calm that cannot be easily unsettled. And in that standing apart, there is a kind of authority that does not need to announce itself. It is felt rather than spoken, understood rather than debated. People often mistake silence for surrender, because they are conditioned to believe that power must always be loud, must always declare itself in order to exist. But silence carries a different kind of strength, one that is rooted in observation rather than reaction, in clarity rather than confusion. It allows a person to see what chaos is trying to hide behind its noise, to recognize patterns that would otherwise be obscured by emotional engagement. When you choose silence, you are not avoiding reality. You are refusing to be consumed by its most distorted forms. There is a deep preservation that happens in that choice, where energy is no longer scattered into battles that do not lead to understanding or peace. Instead, it is gathered inward, held carefully, protected from unnecessary depletion. Silence becomes a boundary that does not need enforcement because it does not invite intrusion. It simply does not participate. And in that non-participation, something shifts in the dynamic of power itself, because chaos depends on reaction to sustain itself, while silence removes the fuel it requires to continue. This is why silence is often uncomfortable for those who expect response, because it removes the mirror they rely on to validate their own intensity. Yet for the one who chooses it, silence becomes a place of clarity, where truth is no longer tangled with emotional noise, where understanding can form without interruption, and where the self is no longer fragmented by constant engagement with disorder. It is in this space that restraint reveals itself not as weakness, but as mastery. The ability to remain centered when everything around is attempting to pull you outward into confusion. Over time, silence reshapes perception. allowing a person to recognize that not all battles are external, that many are invitations to lose oneself in unnecessary struggle, and that true strength often lies in the refusal to step into arenas where nothing meaningful can be built or preserved. And in that refusal there is a steady reclaiming of inner balance that does not depend on being understood by chaos or acknowledged by noise, but simply exists in its own grounded stillness that continues without needing to prove anything to the disturbance around it. Some environments are not meant to be fixed, only left behind, and this truth becomes clear only after repeated attempts to repair what was never built to hold you in the first place. There is a stage in life where effort feels like responsibility, where staying and trying and adjusting are mistaken for commitment, even when the foundation itself resists every attempt at healing. People often believe that with enough patience, enough explanation, or enough sacrifice, broken dynamics will eventually transform into something stable. But not every space is designed for restoration, and not every relationship, place, or pattern is capable of becoming what you hope it will be. Some environments are structured around repetition of harm rather than resolution, where cycles continue regardless of intention, and where your presence becomes part of the mechanism that sustains imbalance instead of resolving it. In such spaces, the desire to fix things can quietly become a form of self-neglect because it keeps you tied to outcomes that never arrive, while your own well-being slowly erodes in the process. There is a deep emotional investment that makes leaving difficult, because it feels like giving up on potential, on history, on the idea that things could still change if you just tried differently. But clarity begins when you recognize that effort alone does not guarantee transformation, especially when the environment itself is resistant to change. Some places do not respond to care. They respond only by repeating what they already are. And in that realization, a difficult truth emerges. Continuing to fix what refuses to change often means abandoning yourself in increments that feel small at first, but accumulate into exhaustion over time. Leaving, then, is not an act of defeat, but an act of discernment, a recognition that energy should not be endlessly poured into systems that cannot hold it without distortion. It is the understanding that preservation sometimes requires separation, that protecting your inner stability may mean stepping away from what continues to destabilize it. This does not come easily, because attachment often disguises itself as responsibility, and familiarity can feel like obligation even when it is harmful. Yet there is a point where awareness shifts, where you begin to see that your presence is not the solution to everything that is broken around you, and that some structures were never meant to evolve through your endurance alone. In that space of understanding, leaving becomes an act of honesty rather than avoidance, a refusal to keep participating in cycles that demand more of you than they return, and a quiet acknowledgement that peace cannot be built in environments that continuously dismantle it, no matter how much intention or care is invested, because what is fundamentally misaligned cannot be repaired through persistence alone. And recognizing this becomes the first step toward reclaiming a life that is no longer defined by attempts to fix what consistently resists becoming whole while you remain inside it. True peace begins the moment you stop explaining your absence to those who never valued your presence. And that moment often arrives quietly, after a long period of emotional exhaustion disguised as effort. There is a stage in human connection where explanation becomes habitual, where you feel compelled to justify why you feel hurt, why you are distant, why you are changing, as if clarity must always be earned through repetition. But in relationships where presence was never truly honored, explanation becomes a loop that leads nowhere, because understanding was never the real intention on the other side. Instead, it becomes a performance you keep offering to people who have already decided not to fully see you. And over time, this performance drains something essential, because it places your peace in the hands of those who benefit from your continued availability, but do not reciprocate your emotional truth. The breaking point is not always loud. Sometimes it is a slow recognition that every explanation you give only deepens your exhaustion while changing nothing in the dynamic itself. That is when silence begins to feel less like withdrawal and more like recovery, a way of reclaiming energy that was being spent on convincing others of your worth. True peace requires this shift, because peace cannot coexist with constant justification. When you keep explaining your absence, you are still emotionally present in the space that no longer values you, still tied to its expectations, still shaped by its need for your accessibility. But the moment you stop explaining, something important changes internally. You begin to detach from the need for external validation, from the hope that understanding will finally arrive if you phrase yourself correctly one more time. This is where peace begins to grow, not in being understood, but in no longer needing to be understood by those who have repeatedly chosen misunderstanding or indifference. There is a quiet dignity in no longer chasing closure from people who never participated in your emotional reality with sincerity. It is not bitterness, it is clarity. It is the recognition that your presence does not require constant explanation to be legitimate, and your absence does not require permission to exist. When you stop explaining, you stop reopening wounds that only exist because you keep inviting them into conversation. You step out of the cycle where your value is constantly negotiated, and you begin to reclaim a sense of internal stability that does not depend on external approval. This is where peace becomes sustainable, because it is no longer contingent on being acknowledged by those who overlooked you, but instead rooted in your own decision to no longer participate in spaces where your absence speaks more truth than any explanation ever could. And in that shift, there is a profound settling within the self, where energy is no longer fragmented across attempts to be seen by those who were never looking with care in the first place, and instead begins to return inward, creating a quiet completeness that no longer asks for confirmation or response from environments that had already demonstrated their inability to hold your presence with the attention it deserved.